So before we attach our border, let's make sure all our edges are nice straight lines. And if you can see here, I've just got this one block that's just come out ever so slightly. So what I'll do is I'll just check all my edges and I'll just give them a little bit of a trim if I can see that happening. So I'll take my ruler and I'll line it up with this edge here and this edge here. So that's one straight line. And I'm just going to trim off this excess right here. It was only a little bit, but now that just means I've got a nice straight line here. And what I'll do is I'll just go around and check all my edges that I don't have little bits just poking out, so that I don't accidentally sew that at a 1/4 inch seam and it's going to be a little bit wobbly. So I think I have that happening in just a couple of places. You might want to spread your quilt right out and have a good look at it. Okay, mine only did that in one spot, so I just tidied up that one spot there. So now let's attach our borders. Okay, so now we need to work out how long we need to cut our strips for our borders to attach them to our quilt top. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the sides first and then we'll do the top. My quilt top is a square, so it doesn't really matter where I measure, but if your quilt is a rectangle, we'll do the sides first and then the top. So we'll do the longer strip first and then we're going to come along and do the top. So what I've done here is I've got my quilt and I've spread it all out nice and smooth. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the measurement from the middle of the quilt, because at the bottom of the quilt, those edges could be slightly stretched and a little bit skewed. We're going to get the best measurement from the center of our quilt. So I'm going to measure it from here. I've got my strips here, and what I'll do is I'm just going to lay it out. I'm going to place it on top and I'm going to come past the edge of my quilt, making sure, I'll just move that along a bit, making sure I'm going to be able to cut those selvages off. I don't want selvages in my quilt top. And I'm going to line it up with some of my stitching, which is a seam here, because we don't want to accidentally have it going across like this crooked, because then it will be out as well. So I'm going to line it up with that seam. I've got a little bit off the edge there, just pull that across. And then what I'll do is I'll come along and I'm just going to place it on top nicely. So it's a bit like the binding. We just want it sitting on top nicely. We're not stretching it. We want it smoothed out. And when we're happy, I'm just going to roughly cut this edge past the edge of my quilt, because I'm going to come along and cut that nicely with my cutter. Okay, so I'm just going to cut here, cut past the edge of my quilt, and we're going to come along and fix that up with the rotary cutter. And then what I'll do is I'm going to place another strip on top of this one, because we need two, one for either side. Okay, so I'll do that again. I'm just going to place this on top, coming past the edge nicely, and I'll smooth that out, not pulling it taut, it's just literally placed on top. And then again, I'll just cut that roughly. And now what I'll do is I'll just pull this across so you can see. I've got that nicely smoothed out, not taut, and now I'm going to take my rotary cutter and just come along and cut these edges. So what I'll do is I'll take my ruler and I'm going to line up my ruler with the edge of my quilt at the top here and at the bottom, and then I'll just cut those strips. So it's a nice straight line. And then I'll do the same for the other side. So I'll just shimmy across my quilt and I'll come across to this other side. And I'm just going to push my mat so it comes out the other end. Okay, and now I'm on the other side. I'm going to line my ruler up with the edge of my quilt and I'll trim this edge too. So now I know I've got 2 perfect strips to do both sides of my quilt, and now we're going to attach them with pins and sew them. Okay, so now we're going to attach the borders to our quilt top, remembering we are working on the longest edge of our quilts. For me, mine is square, so it doesn't matter too much. And the first thing we need to do is work out the middle of the quilt edge. I know that the center of the square here is the middle of my quilt, so I'll start from here. By all means, get a measuring tape if you'd like to work out exactly the middle of your quilt, but I know mine is roughly here. Then what I'm going to do is take my strip and fold it in half, and I will line up those ends and I'll finger press it so I know where the middle of that is, and I'm going to line it up with the middle of my quilt. Now we need to make sure it's facing the right way, so we take the right side of the fabric, remembering I've got my seams here, and we place the right sides down onto the right side of your quilt. I take my finger pressed mark and I line it up with the middle of my quilt top here. I'm going to line up all my edges, well, both my edges, and then I'll pin it. And then what I'll do is I'll come to the end and I'll line up all the edges here on the left and on the right, line them up, and I'll pin that. I'll come to the other end and I'll pin those down together, lining up all those edges. And then you can use as many or as little pins as you like to do the rest. Just make sure the 2 edges are lined up nicely. Okay, and once we've done that, we'll do exactly the same thing to the other edge. Okay, so now I'm on the other side, I'll do exactly the same. I know the middle of my quilt is here. I'll take my strip and I'll fold it in half, lining up these edges perfectly. I'll give that a finger press. I'll make sure it's facing up the right way with my seams facing me and the good side of my fabric facing down onto the good side of my quilt. I'll pin it in the middle. And then I'll pin both the ends first. And then I'll pin all the rest. Okay, so once we've pinned both those sides, again remembering we're doing the long sides first, now let's sew those on. Okay, so let's sew our borders on. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on. I'm sewing at stitch length 2. I know it's stitching nicely. I'm going to lower my foot and off we go. I've got my needles, I've got my pins, right out of the way so I don't even have to move them. Okay, so now I'm just going to do the next border, and as I'm coming up to some of these seams underneath, if I can feel that they're not sitting properly, I am just stopping and pausing and just making sure they're facing up the right way. Okay, so once we've sewn that, now we need to set our seams and press them. Okay, so now we need to set our seams, finger press it open and press. So we'll come along and we'll set the seams, and I want you to do this all the way along for both sides of the border. And then we'll open it up and we'll have these seams facing this way. We don't want them facing against this way because they've got a lot of seams to come up against. So we'll keep them coming out this way, so you can see them slightly underneath your border there. We'll finger press that open, and we'll press. And what I would like you to do is to do that along both sides of your border, please. Okay, so now we've sewn our borders on our longer sides of our quilt, whether it's a square, it won't matter, or if it's a rectangle. And we've sewn them on, and we've set the seams, and we've pressed them open, and now we're ready to attach our borders for the top. We need to do the same process. So I've got my strips here for my border. What I'm going to do is I'm somewhere in the middle of my quilt here. Remember, we're not down the bottom because that could be warped or skewed. So I'm somewhere in the middle. It doesn't matter, you don't have to measure exactly in the middle. We just don't want to be using those ends. And I'm going to line up with some of my sewing lines there, my seams, so I know that I'm not accidentally a little bit crooked. And I'm going to line up with this line here, and I'm going to start past the edge of my quilt, and you can see I'm going past my border because that's the new edge of my quilt, and I don't want my salvages in it, so I've got a little bit of extra space there, so I know when I cut it off I'll be fine. And then I'm going to come along and smooth it out, remembering we're not pulling it taut, we just want it nice and smooth. And now my quilt's getting a little bit big and it doesn't quite fit on my desk here, so I know that's all good. So I'm just going to shimmy it across and come to the end here, and I'll continue on. And then again with my scissors, I'm just going to roughly cut that. So now I'm back at the beginning, and I'm just going to take my second strip, because remember we need one for the top and for the bottom, and I'm going to place that on top. And I'm going to spread that out nicely again, smoothing it out, not taut. And I'm coming to the other side. The table's not quite big enough, so I'll just shimmy that across. And then I'm going to just cut this roughly. Okay, so now I'm at one of my edges again. I'm just going to smooth that out. I'm going to take my ruler, line it up with my new edge. So my border is now my new edge, and I'm just going to cut this excess off. And then what I'm going to do is just shimmy it across so I can do the same on the other side. Okay, so now I'm on the other side of my quilt, and this is the new edge of my quilt. I just need to cut this excess off, so I will line up my ruler onto the edge of my border there, and I'll cut that excess off. Now, we're not really meant to be cutting this way, but it's just such a small piece that we're cutting. I am doing this. If this makes you feel a little bit nervous, you can flip your quilt all the way around so you are working on the right side. So I'll just trim that off, and now we're going to pin it. Okay, so now we just need to do exactly the same thing we did the first time we attached the borders. We need to find the middle of our quilt, and this is my middle square, and this is the middle of that square, so I know I'll be pinning here. We need to take our border, fold it in half, line up those corners there, come down to find the middle and give that a finger press, and then we'll place that on the middle of our quilt top, remembering to face it the right way. So there's my finger press, and I'll place it right on there, and that's the middle for me. I've got my seams facing up, and this is the good side of my fabric facing the good side of my quilt, so I'll pin it there. And then I'll do the same to the edges. Now my quilt's getting a little bit big, so I'll just shimmy that across. And I'll pin it here in the corner, making sure the edges are lining up nicely. And then I'll pin the other corner, once again shimmering across. And I'm pulling that one a little bit taut, and that's okay. When we sew that on, it'll be perfect, and then when we iron it'll sit really nicely. And now what I need to do is line up all these edges and pin it, and you can use as many or as little pins as you like. now I'll do exactly the same on the other end. Finished pinning both our borders on for the top and the bottom. Let's sew them on. Okay, so now let's sew on the top and the bottom of our borders, remembering all the same rules apply. And as you're coming along, if you feel these seams are not sitting correctly, like this one is meant to be facing up and I might, as I'm coming up to it, I might feel that it's not quite sitting right, I can stop and just make sure it is sitting correctly. And also don't forget, if you get really close to the foot, you can always just pause, lift your foot up in the middle of sewing and just get in there and correct it. Don't be afraid to stop and lift that foot up if you need to get right in there and work underneath where the foot is. So I'm going to sew my top and bottom border on now. Okay, so now that's all done, now we need to set the seams again and then finger press it open and press. Okay everyone, so now we've attached our borders to our quilt tops, we've finished our quilt tops. So what I would like you to do is refer back to my first course, Your First Quilt, week 3, when I discuss how to prepare your quilt top for basting, and then I go into how you baste a quilt. All the instructions are exactly the same. So please baste your quilt ready for next week when we will be quilting them. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe and leave a comment.